I didn't know how to move on from it. But then I met Shadow and everything changed. Have you ever felt like nothing could fill the emptiness inside? For Ella, after losing her father, the world felt like it had lost all color. But when she met Shadow, a quiet dog with a powerful presence, everything shifted. Through their bond, Ella discovered that healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. It comes with patience, love, and the simple act of being present. But as she heals, she realizes her journey isn't just for her. It's for everyone who needs to believe in second chances. How will Ella's newfound strength impact not just her, but everyone she meets along the way? And what role will Shadow play in helping her unlock the power to heal others? Welcome to our channel, where stories of transformation and hope unfold. If you've ever struggled with healing or felt lost, this story is for you. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join us on this emotional journey. Let's dive into Ella's story, starting from the moment she met Shadow and began to find the healing she never thought possible.
The Dog Stories 4.0.
Sometimes, the loudest things are the ones that don't make a sound. Ella Parker stood on the edge of the Willow Creek Animal Shelter, staring at the faded sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. The air around her was still, a calm before the storm, though no actual storm was coming. The stillness of the moment seemed out of place. The usual hustle of the small town had paused for a moment, as if the whole town was holding its breath. She rubbed the sleeve of her hoodie nervously, the fabric stretched out from too many times of fidgeting. She wasn't a talker. Never had been. Words were like coins, and Ella wasn't about to spend them unless she absolutely had to. Her life, as it was, had been marked by too much silence. The silence of a house that felt too empty, the silence of a mother too tired to say much, and the silence of grief that she carried inside, hidden in plain sight. The dogs inside the shelter barked, yipped, and whined, their voices clashing against the cold walls. But there was one dog who stood out amidst the chaos, a silent, still presence. Ella had heard the stories. She had heard the rumors of this dog who didn't bark, didn't move, just sat there, waiting. "Y'all here for the Saturday tour?" A woman's voice called from inside. Ella jumped slightly, startled by the sudden sound. She turned her head to see a middle-aged woman, stocky in build, pushing a mop across the shelter's floor. She wore a Red Willow Creek high sweatshirt beneath her apron, and her name tag read Darlene. Her voice was rough, but there was something kind in the way she spoke. "We're just looking." Helen Parker, Ella's mother, replied softly, with a hesitant glance toward her daughter. "Well, don't let the smell scare you," Darlene said, resting her mop against the wall. "They're mostly clean, most of them." Ella followed her mother into the building. The shelter was warmer than she expected, but the smell of bleach and old fur lingered, clinging to the air. She kept her hands deep in her pockets, a defensive habit she couldn't shake. Her eyes were drawn to the dogs, who jumped at the bars of their kennels or paced anxiously in circles, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them too long. They weren't her dogs. They weren't hers to care for. It was when they reached the far end of the row that she saw him. In Kennel 12, there sat a German Shepherd, unlike any dog Ella had ever seen. He wasn't barking. He wasn't even standing. He was sitting perfectly still in the back corner of the kennel, with his head slightly tilted to one side. His eyes were locked on Ella's, as if he had been waiting for her, too. His fur was patchy, tangled in some places, and his right eye was clouded with age, while the other glowed a fierce amber. He looked older, maybe 8 or 9, and there were visible scars on his legs. Despite his rough appearance, there was a kind of dignity in the way he sat. He didn't cower, and he didn't challenge. He simply waited. Ella stopped walking. Something stirred in her chest, something unfamiliar but undeniable. "Oh," Darlene muttered from behind, before adding, "that one's different." Ella didn't answer. She stepped closer to the kennel, her heart beating faster. The dog didn't move, not a twitch. "What's his name?" Ella asked, surprising herself with the sound of her own voice. Darlene approached with the keys jingling at her waist. She unlocked the cage and walked closer. "He doesn't have much. Just says Shadow on the tag. No chip, no papers." A ranger found him wandering near the base of Elk Ridge about 2 months ago. No one's claimed him. No one's really tried. Ella crouched down slowly, her forearms resting on her knees. She mirrored the dog's calm. She didn't know why, but the stillness between them felt right. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. "He's not scary?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darlene paused for a moment. "No, but he makes people feel something that scares them more." Ella leaned in slightly, her gaze fixed on the dog's collar. The leather was worn, the edges frayed from time, but what caught her attention was the small brass tag hanging from it. She squinted, and with the quiet of the room, she read aloud, "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." Darlene's voice softened. "That's the only reason he hasn't been put down? That tag. It stopped us. Stopped all of us." Shadow blinked once, and Ella felt something shift inside her chest. It was subtle, like the first thaw of frost after a long winter, but it was there. Something was happening. Something she didn't understand. Ella looked up at her mother, who had quietly approached behind her. "You want to meet him?" Helen asked, her voice soft and careful. Ella nodded, almost without thinking. Darlene unlocked the gate, and the sound of the creaky door filled the air. But Shadow didn't jump up, didn't bolt for the door. Instead, he stood slowly, with deliberate, stiff movements, and walked toward Ella like a man too proud to limp, but too old to rush. When he reached her, he stopped just inches away and looked up at her, waiting. Ella extended her hand slowly, hesitantly, and rested it on the top of his matted fur between his ears. There was no flinch, no growl, just warmth. And then, for the first time in a long time, Ella felt something settle in her heart. Ella didn't speak much that day, but the silence between her and Shadow was enough to say everything that needed to be said. The car ride home was filled with nothing but the steady hum of the engine and the sound of Shadow's soft breathing. He was lying at her feet, his body curled into a loose ball, his head resting comfortably on the edge of the seat. Ella's fingers drummed lightly on her lap as she glanced down at the dog, her thoughts swirling like the autumn leaves outside. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. There was a strange mix of something like relief and something more hopeful. The weight of the brass tag in her pocket, now pressed firmly against her leg, was a constant reminder of the words she had read aloud. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." For a long time, Ella had wondered if she mattered. Her father's death had left an empty space in her world, one that no amount of silence seemed to fill. Her mother, though kind and loving, was often too exhausted to offer more than a smile, and Ella, in return, had grown used to retreating into her own world. But now, sitting next to a dog who had once been forgotten, she felt a shift. Shadow, despite his rough appearance, was teaching her something without saying a word. She had always thought that silence was a sign of weakness or sadness, but this dog was showing her that sometimes silence could be just as powerful as words. When they reached the house on Juniper Lane, the wind had picked up, rustling the bare branches of the maple tree in the yard. It was the kind of quiet that made everything seem still and reflective. As they pulled into the driveway, Ella felt a sudden sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if Shadow had brought with him a sense of peace, something she hadn't realized was missing from her life. Ella opened the door for him, and he stepped out with the grace of someone who had been here before. He didn't run or bark, but instead walked carefully up the front steps and paused at the door, sniffing the air before entering. Inside, the house was warm, but there was a familiar chill in the air, an emptiness that had settled there ever since her father had passed. The smell of cinnamon still lingered from her mother's baking earlier in the week, mixing with the scent of wood and dust. "Come on in, Shadow," Ella whispered, her voice softer than usual. "This is home now." Shadow stepped inside without hesitation. He didn't seem bothered by the change of scenery or the unfamiliar surroundings. Instead, he moved through the house with purpose, walking slowly but with a quiet dignity that reminded Ella of the slow passage of time. He wasn't in a rush to find a place. He simply took in the environment with the calmness of someone who had learned not to expect anything but to accept what came. Ella followed him into the living room, watching as he approached the couch. His eyes scanned the space before he walked to the empty dog bed in the corner. It had once belonged to Rusty, the golden retriever who had passed away 2 years ago. The bed had remained untouched since then, kept clean but never used. It was as though it had become a monument to Rusty's memory, a part of the house no one wanted to disturb. Shadow circled the bed once, twice, before lying down in the exact spot where Rusty had once rested. His body curled into the shape of a question mark, a soft sigh escaping from his chest as he settled in. Ella watched him for a long moment, her heart swelling with a strange mix of emotions. She had always believed that things had to be perfect to be worth it, that everything needed to be in its right place. But now, seeing Shadow lying on that bed, she realized that maybe life didn't need to be perfect. Sometimes it was enough to simply exist, to be present, to matter without needing to fill the empty spaces. Her mother, Helen, came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She stopped when she saw Shadow lying in Rusty's bed, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "He found it," she said softly. "I guess that settles it." Ella didn't say anything in response. She just nodded, the warmth of her mother's presence grounding her. The silence between them was no longer heavy or uncomfortable. It felt easy, like they were both beginning to understand something without having to explain it. For the rest of the evening, nothing extraordinary happened. They ate dinner, spaghetti, like always, but this time it didn't feel routine. It felt like something new, something with potential. Shadow didn't beg for food or jump up to the table, but instead, he lay beside it, his calm presence a reminder of what it meant to simply be. Later, after dinner, when her mother was washing the dishes, Ella stood up and walked into the backyard. Shadow followed her, his footsteps soft on the wet grass. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, cool smell that filled the air. They sat together beneath the maple tree, neither of them speaking. The evening was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the branches and the soft rhythm of their breathing. Ella leaned back against the trunk of the tree, her eyes closing as she listened to the wind. She didn't know how long they sat there, but it didn't matter. The world felt different now, quieter, more accepting. Shadow sat beside her, his body close enough that she could feel his warmth, but far enough away to respect her space. He wasn't trying to fix anything or offer advice. He was just there, and somehow that was enough. Ella's hand rested lightly on his fur, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The next few days passed in a slow, rhythmic pattern like the soft ticking of a clock. The air around Willow Creek had turned colder, a sign that winter was creeping closer. The maple tree outside Ella's house stood tall and bare, its branches reaching into the sky as though yearning for the warmth of spring. Each day felt slightly heavier than the last, but there was a new quiet in the house, a kind of peacefulness that had settled in with Shadow's presence. Ella woke up earlier now, no longer dreading the silence of the morning. She found herself sitting at the kitchen table, drinking hot cocoa while watching the sunrise through the window. The golden light filtered through the trees and cast a warm glow over the backyard. It was a moment of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Shadow had made himself at home. He moved through the house with the confidence of a dog who had belonged there forever. He didn't rush, didn't make noise, he simply existed in the space, filling the void without demanding attention. It was almost as if he understood the delicate balance of the home and knew when to give Ella her space and when to simply be there. Helen noticed it too. At first, she had been cautious about Shadow's presence, unsure of how a dog with such a rough past might fit into their quiet life. But now she could see the difference. The way Shadow moved, so sure of himself, so steady, he brought something to their home that neither of them had realized they were missing. One afternoon, as the rain began to fall gently outside, Ella stood by the window, her arms crossed as she watched the droplets slide down the glass. She didn't feel like going outside today. Her thoughts were too tangled, and the comfort of being inside, with the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, was too inviting. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He was still, as always, but there was a quiet energy about him, a presence that Ella couldn't ignore. It was as if he were guarding her, not in the way a protector might with fear sparking or running in circles, but in a way that made her feel safe. It was hard to describe, but there was something incredibly calming about the way he sat beside her, the way he didn't demand her attention, yet made it impossible to ignore him. Ella knew now that he wasn't just a dog, he was something more. He was a quiet guardian, watching over her, even if she hadn't fully realized it yet. That afternoon, Helen came home from work earlier than usual, her tired face lighting up as she saw the calmness that had settled in the living room. She stopped in the doorway, looking at Ella and then at Shadow, who hadn't moved from his spot. "How's he doing?" Helen asked softly. Ella turned and smiled, a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. "He's perfect," she said. "I think he's the one who's been taking care of me." Helen raised an eyebrow, surprised at the tenderness in her daughter's voice. "He's just a dog, Ella." "Yeah," Ella said, her voice steady. "But sometimes I think he knows more than we do." For a moment, the house was still, the kind of stillness that Ella had grown to appreciate, peaceful and gentle, like the sound of snow falling outside, soft and effortless. She felt something shift in her chest, something that had been buried deep inside her for a long time. The grief, the loneliness, the uncertainty, it was all still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Shadow's quiet presence had begun to lift the weight. That night, as the wind howled outside and the first real snow of the season began to fall, Ella sat on the couch with Shadow by her side. She watched the flakes dance in the light of the street lamp outside, their delicate forms floating down to the ground. She didn't know why, but she felt safe. Safe in a way she hadn't felt since her father's passing. She turned to Shadow, who was lying at her feet, his eyes half closed but alert. He didn't seem to mind the snow. In fact, he seemed to embrace it, as if he had always been a part of this world, a guardian of the stillness. Ella reached down, gently running her fingers through his fur. He shifted slightly and their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but in that moment, Ella knew something. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The next morning, Ella woke up early again, but this time, it wasn't the cold that made her get out of bed. It was the sense that something had changed. Something had clicked. She opened the window, letting the cold air fill the room, and took in the sight of the winter morning. The world outside had turned into a soft wonderland. The trees were covered in snow, their branches heavy with the weight of it. The quiet was everywhere, wrapping the town in a peaceful hush. Shadow was standing beside her, his eyes watching the snowflakes fall. His presence felt like a promise, like the quiet bond they shared was unspoken but deeply understood. He wasn't just a dog. He was a companion, a reminder that even in the midst of silence, there could be connection, and that sometimes, just being there was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life in Willow Creek continued its steady pace. The town, with its cobbled streets and gentle hills, settled into the quiet of winter. Ella's life had also begun to follow a quieter pattern, one that felt more comfortable than it ever had before. She didn't rush anymore. She didn't feel the need to constantly fill the silence with noise or words. Instead, she learned to live in it, to embrace it. Ella found herself waking up earlier each day, not out of habit, but because something inside her had changed. The mornings were calm, with the soft light of dawn creeping through the curtains, and Shadow would be there, sitting by the window, watching the world outside. His presence was constant, steady, a silent companion who never asked for anything but offered everything in return. One day after school, Ella decided to take Shadow for a walk. The snow had stopped falling, and the streets of Willow Creek were blanketed in a thick layer of white. The trees, heavy with snow, looked like something out of a dream. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your cheeks and made your breath visible in the winter light. Shadow trotted alongside her, his steps slow and deliberate. Ella didn't rush him. She didn't need to. He moved at his own pace, just like he had from the moment they met. They walked to the old park near the edge of town. The swings hung still, covered in snow, and the old merry-go-round was quiet. Ella sat on one of the benches, and Shadow, as always, settled at her feet, his body curling into a comfortable ball. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ella watched the world around her, how the snowflakes danced in the wind, how the ground shimmered in the pale light of the afternoon. There was something deeply peaceful about it all. The stillness, the quiet, the simplicity of it. It was then that Ella realized how much she had changed. She had come to Willow Creek a broken girl, lost in grief and silence. But now, with Shadow by her side, she was beginning to find herself again. Not in loud moments or grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday moments that seemed to hold the most meaning. Shadow shifted beside her, his amber eyes meeting hers. There was something in those eyes, something understanding. Ella smiled softly, reaching down to stroke his fur. He didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to bark or wag his tail. He simply was, and that was enough. "Thanks," Ella whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "You've helped me more than I can say." Shadow's tail gave a small thump, a gentle acknowledgement of her words. It wasn't much, but to Ella, it meant everything. He had become more than just a dog. He had become a mirror of sorts, reflecting the quiet parts of her that had been buried deep inside for so long. As they sat there, Ella's mind wandered back to the day they first met. She remembered the brass tag, the words that had resonated so deeply within her. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." In that moment, Ella realized that the words on the tag weren't just for the dog. They were for her too. She had been struggling with the belief that she mattered, that she could still find a purpose in a world that had seemed so harsh and unyielding. But Shadow had found her, just as she had found him. And in that simple, quiet act of connection, they both had begun to heal. "Maybe that's what we all need," Ella murmured, her voice barely audible against the quiet of the park. "Someone to believe we matter." Shadow lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers once again. Ella smiled, a genuine smile, full of warmth and understanding. They stayed there for what felt like hours, the world outside moving on, but for Ella and Shadow, time seemed to stand still. There was no rush, no need for anything to change. The peace between them was enough. When Ella finally stood up to leave, Shadow followed her, his pace still slow but steady. The snow crunched under their feet as they made their way back home, and for the first time in a long while, Ella felt like she was walking towards something good, something real. Days drifted by, and the quiet harmony between Ella and Shadow settled deeper into their daily lives. The world outside Willow Creek seemed to rush forward with the changing seasons, but within the walls of Ella's home, time seemed to slow down. It wasn't a slow pace out of boredom or exhaustion. It was a peaceful kind of slow, the kind that allowed room for reflection, growth, and healing. Ella found herself becoming more attuned to the stillness. She woke up each morning with a sense of calm, a feeling she had not known for years. When she glanced over at Shadow, curled up at the foot of her bed, she felt a warmth spread inside her chest. It was as though the dog's quiet presence had begun to fill the empty spaces inside her, spaces that she had once believed could never be filled. One afternoon, as Ella and Shadow walked through the park, the world around them was wrapped in a blanket of snow. The park, with its empty swings and frozen pond, looked like something out of a dream. The crisp air bit at Ella's cheeks, but she didn't mind. Shadow, as always, walked at her side, his steps slow but steady. She had stopped trying to rush. No longer did she wish for time to move faster or for the pain to go away instantly. Instead, she had learned to let the moments unfold as they would, accepting the stillness that Shadow had taught her to embrace. "Thank you, Shadow," Ella whispered, her voice barely a breath against the winter air. "You've taught me more than anyone ever could." Shadow didn't respond. He never did. But as they walked, Ella could feel the weight of his presence beside her, his steady companionship offering her something she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't just the comforting silence, it was the sense that even in their quiet, they were healing together. Ella had been broken, but so had Shadow. And through their shared stillness, they had begun to piece themselves back together. They reached the edge of the park where the road curved sharply, leading toward the small town center. Ella had passed this way countless times before, but today, something felt different. She paused, looking out at the empty street, and for the first time, she didn't feel the heaviness she had once carried. "Maybe it's time to move forward," Ella said softly, mostly to herself. Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes watching her with that quiet understanding that had become his trademark. He didn't need to say anything. His mere presence was all the encouragement she needed. Later that evening, after dinner, Ella sat in the living room, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background. Shadow was lying next to her, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that she had once feared, but now found comfort in. Helen entered the room, a cup of tea in hand. She stopped in the doorway, watching Ella and Shadow for a moment before speaking. "I see a change in you," Helen said gently, setting the tea down on the table beside Ella. "It's like you found a part of yourself you thought you'd lost." Ella looked up at her mother, her eyes softening. "I have," she said quietly, "and it's because of him." She reached down, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. "He's helped me realize that it's okay to be still, to not have to move so fast all the time." Helen nodded, her eyes glistening with something close to pride. "I'm glad you found that peace. You deserve it." For the first time in a long while, Ella felt the weight of her grief begin to lift, even if just a little. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that shelter months ago, lost and broken. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who could embrace the quiet without feeling afraid. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Ella took a moment to step outside. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was still blanketed in white. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air fill her lungs, and exhaled slowly, watching the mist of her breath float into the morning sky. Shadow stood beside her, his coat blending with the snow around them. The two of them stood there together, alone but not lonely. In the stillness of the moment, Ella realized that the silence had become a friend rather than a foe. She no longer feared it. She had come to understand its power. "You're right," Ella whispered to Shadow. "Sometimes, just being here is enough." Winter in Willow Creek lingered like an old friend who couldn't bear to say goodbye. The snow that had once blanketed the town had begun to melt, leaving behind patches of ice and mud. Yet, despite the changing season, the quiet calm between Ella and Shadow remained unchanged. Every day, they shared moments of peace in their quiet corner of the world. But for Ella, something was shifting inside her, something she couldn't quite place but knew was coming. It was a Saturday afternoon when the first real test of her healing came. Ella had been feeling different, a sense of something new beginning to take shape. She wasn't sure if it was because of Shadow's steady presence or if it was because she had allowed herself to finally feel something again. But she knew that the time had come for her to take another step. She sat on the porch steps, watching as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Shadow lay beside her, his body stretched out in the fading light. It had become their ritual, sitting together in the quiet, watching the world turn, feeling time pass without the need for words. But today, Ella felt the urge to do something more. She reached down and ran her hand through Shadow's fur, letting the soft strands slip between her fingers. The air was cool against her skin, but there was warmth between them, between her and the dog who had become more than just a companion. Shadow had become her silent protector, her reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still room for peace. "You've been there for me through everything," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet evening air. "Now it's time for me to be there for you." Shadow lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting hers. There was no barking, no tail wagging, just the silent understanding that had passed between them since the day they met. In that moment, Ella realized that she had never truly been alone. She had always had Shadow, and through him, she had found her way back to herself. The next morning, Ella woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the promise of spring that made her feel this way, it was the quiet strength she had discovered within herself, with Shadow by her side. She could feel the weight of the past, but it didn't hold her down the way it used to. She was ready for the next step. She slipped on her boots and walked over to Shadow, who was lying by the door, waiting patiently. His eyes followed her every move, a quiet, steady presence in the room. "Come on, Shadow," Ella said, her voice firm with newfound confidence. "Let's go for a walk." The two of them stepped outside, and the world around them seemed to come alive. The air was cool, the sky a pale blue with wisps of white clouds. Ella felt a sense of freedom as she walked, her footsteps in time with Shadow's steady gait. The sounds of the world seemed muted, as if they were walking through a dream. They walked toward the old park once again, the place where Ella had spent so many hours in silence, trying to make sense of the world. Today, though, she wasn't searching for answers. She wasn't looking for a sign. She simply existed, walking beside the dog who had taught her the power of quiet moments. As they reached the park, Ella stopped by the old swings, now buried beneath a layer of snow. The swings that had once swayed in the wind now stood still, frozen in time. She glanced down at Shadow, who was standing still beside her, his eyes focused on the horizon. "You know," Ella said softly, "I used to be afraid of the silence. I thought it meant I was lost. But now I think it's the silence that has found me." Shadow didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Ella knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth beneath his coat. The stillness around them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of everything she had been searching for and everything she had been too afraid to face. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, Ella allowed herself to smile. A real smile. One that didn't hide behind a mask of sorrow or uncertainty. A smile that came from deep within, from a place of acceptance. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." The days that followed were quiet, but they weren't empty. The snow continued to melt, and with it, the barriers Ella had built around herself. Spring was just beginning to whisper through the town of Willow Creek, though the trees were still bare and the air still crisp. But Ella didn't mind. The change wasn't urgent. It was slow, like the thawing of ice, gentle and sure. Ella's bond with Shadow had deepened in a way she hadn't expected. They were no longer just a girl and her dog. They were partners, bound by an unspoken understanding that surpassed words. The way he sat beside her every evening, watching the world outside, gave her a sense of peace she had never known before. And in turn, Ella had become his steady companion. She had grown into someone who could sit with the silence, someone who could be at peace with herself and with him. One morning, as Ella sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunlight filter through the window, she felt a stir of curiosity deep inside her. For weeks, she had stayed in the safe confines of home. She had been content with her small world, her quiet routines. But now she could feel the pull of something more, something that lay just outside the door, waiting for her to take that first step. "Shadow," Ella murmured, her voice low as the dog lay at her feet. "I think it's time to go on an adventure." Shadow lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting hers. He didn't need to respond. He was always ready, always there, waiting for her to lead the way. Ella grabbed her coat and slipped it on, the cold air from the hallway rushing past her. She didn't know where they would go, but for the first time, she didn't need to have a plan. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. It was about moving forward, step by step, into the unknown, with Shadow by her side. They left the house and walked down the street, the world around them waking up to the quiet promise of spring. The ground was wet from the melting snow, and the air smelled of earth and pine. Ella breathed it in, the scent of new beginnings. She didn't look back. Shadow walked beside her, steady and unhurried, his tail low and his gaze alert. He had never rushed, not once, and neither did Ella feel the need to hurry. With every step they took, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little more, replaced by something lighter, something brighter. They made their way to the edge of town, toward a small trail that led into the woods. Ella had walked this trail before, but it felt different now. It felt like the beginning of something, a chapter she had yet to write. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of the town faded. All that was left was the rustling of the trees and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. Ella had always loved the quiet of the forest. It was here, among the trees, that she felt most herself, free from the expectations of others, free from the noise of the world. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Ella stopped for a moment, closing her eyes, allowing the peace of the forest to wash over her. The stillness was no longer something to fear. It was something she could embrace. Shadow sat beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Ella reached down and ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. In that moment, she knew that no matter where life took her, she would always have him by her side. And that was enough. "Thank you," Ella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes, as if to say, "You don't need to thank me. I'm just here." Ella smiled, a real smile, one that came from deep inside. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted the moment, and Ella turned to see an older woman walking down the trail toward her. The woman was bundled in a thick scarf and coat, her white hair tucked neatly beneath a knitted hat. She smiled warmly at Ella and Shadow. "Isn't it beautiful out here?" the woman asked, her voice gentle and kind. "It is," Ella replied, smiling back. "It's peaceful." The woman nodded, her gaze drifting to Shadow. "I see you found a good friend there. Dogs have a way of helping people heal, don't they?" Ella felt a pang of recognition. She had learned that lesson herself. "Yes, they do," she said softly, looking down at Shadow, who was now lying contentedly at her feet. The woman smiled knowingly, then continued on her walk, leaving Ella and Shadow to enjoy the quiet of the forest once more. For a long time, they stood there, the two of them alone in the woods, surrounded by the peace of nature. Ella had no words, but she didn't need any. The silence spoke for itself. As the days grew longer and the warmth of spring slowly crept into Willow Creek, Ella's journey of self-discovery continued in small, meaningful ways. Shadow remained her steadfast companion, and together, They ventured further into the world, each step bringing them closer to understanding something deeper. The world around them had changed, but so had Ella. The silence that once felt like a heavy burden had transformed into a source of strength, a place where she could hear herself clearly for the first time. The next morning, Ella woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sun was already streaming through the curtains, casting soft rays of light across the room. Shadow was curled up at the foot of her bed, his fur a warm bundle against the cool air of the morning. Ella smiled softly, grateful for the comfort of his presence. She had come a long way since the day she had first brought him home. Back then, she had been unsure, uncertain about everything about her life, her grief, and whether she could ever truly heal. But now, looking at Shadow, she understood that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and one that she didn't have to take alone. Ella slowly climbed out of bed and walked to the window, her eyes taking in the view of the town bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The trees were beginning to bud, their branches reaching for the sky, and the streets were lined with the first flowers of spring. It was as if the town itself was waking up, just like she had. She turned to look at Shadow, who was now awake and stretching, his tail wagging slowly as he stood and padded over to her. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that had only grown stronger with time. Shadow didn't need to speak, didn't need to make noise. His presence alone was enough. Ella reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingertips. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered, "for helping me find peace." Shadow responded by nuzzling her hand gently, as if to say, "I'm here, always." For the first time in a long time, Ella felt the weight of the past lifting. She wasn't sure if it was the changing seasons or the quiet companionship of the dog by her side, but something inside her had shifted. The sadness, the grief, the loneliness, they were still there, but they no longer consumed her. They were just part of her story, not the whole of it. Ella had begun to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to carry it with grace, and to continue moving forward. And with Shadow by her side, she knew she could do just that. After breakfast, Ella grabbed her coat and leash and took Shadow outside. They walked slowly through the yard, the soft earth beneath their feet as they made their way to the edge of the property. Ella stopped at the old maple tree, the one that had stood tall for as long as she could remember. It was a place of peace for her, a place to reflect on all that had changed and all that was still to come. Shadow stood beside her, his head tilted upward as if he too was taking in the beauty of the moment. The wind rustled through the branches, and Ella closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was as if the world had paused just for them, giving them a moment of stillness, a moment of connection. "One day, Shadow," Ella said softly, "I'll be able to look back at all of this and be grateful. Not for the pain, but for the lessons. For the strength to keep going." Shadow's tail wagged slightly, and Ella smiled. "You've taught me so much already." They stood there for a while, the quiet peace of the moment settling over them like a warm blanket. It was the kind of silence that felt full, the kind that held no fear, no sadness, only acceptance. Ella had learned that sometimes the best moments in life were the ones that didn't require anything at all. Just being present, just being with someone who understood, was enough. Ella felt something stir within her, a desire to share this peace with the world. She wasn't sure how or when it would happen, but she knew that it was time for her to step into the world again, to find a way to use the lessons she had learned from Shadow to help others. The idea had been growing inside her for some time now, and today it felt clearer than ever. Later that day, Ella sat at her desk, a notebook open in front of her. She had always enjoyed writing, but she had never shared her thoughts with anyone before. Today, though, felt different. She picked up her pen and began to write. "The healing I have found has been quiet. It has been slow, but it has been real. I have learned that there is strength in silence and peace in stillness. I have learned that sometimes the best way to heal is to simply be." She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. It felt like the right words were coming to her, but they were not enough yet. Ella wanted to help others feel what she had felt, to understand the power of quiet companionship and the comfort that can come from simply being present with someone, whether they are human or animal. As she finished writing, Ella glanced over at Shadow, who was lying at her feet, his eyes half closed in peaceful contentment. She knew what she had to do next. Ella's pen hovered over the page as she stared at the words she had written. There was something liberating about putting her thoughts down and writing, something raw and real that hadn't been there before. The words felt like a release, as if they had been bottled up inside her for so long, waiting for the right moment to be shared. She read through her writing one last time, a sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had never thought of herself as a writer, but now, in the quiet of her room, surrounded by the stillness of her home, and the steady presence of Shadow, Ella knew that this was the beginning of something important. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she was ready to follow it, step by step. The idea of sharing her story had grown inside her like a seed, and now that it had taken root, she couldn't ignore it. It was more than just a desire to write. It was a call to action, a need to make a difference, however small that difference might be. Ella had spent so many years feeling lost, feeling like she didn't matter. But Shadow had shown her the truth, that even in the silence, even in the quiet moments, there was meaning, there was purpose, there was love. Ella glanced down at the brass tag that hung from Shadow's collar. She hadn't noticed it much recently, but today it caught her eye. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn surface, reading the engraving once again. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." A sense of clarity washed over her. She realized that the tag wasn't just a message for Shadow. It was a message for her too. She still mattered. She had always mattered. And now it was time to make sure that others knew they mattered too. As the days passed, Ella continued to write, her journal filling up with thoughts, ideas, and reflections. But she knew that her story wasn't just about herself. It was about the people she had met, the lessons she had learned, and the silent companionship that had helped her heal. And so, she decided to share her story with others. One afternoon, as she sat in the living room, her mother came in, a smile on her face. "How's the writing going?" Helen asked, her voice warm with interest. "It's going well," Ella replied, glancing up from her notebook. "I'm starting to think I might want to do something with it." Helen raised an eyebrow, surprised but supportive. "What do you mean?" "I want to share it," Ella said quietly. I think I have something to say. Something that might help people." Helen's expression softened. "I'm proud of you, Ella," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "I know how much you've been through, and I can see that you're ready to share your story. You've come a long way." Ella smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I couldn't have done it without Shadow," she said, glancing down at the dog, who was lying contentedly at her feet. "He's the one who showed me that I matter." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I think he knows just how much he's helped you." That evening, Ella took her first step toward sharing her story. She emailed a local animal shelter and offered to volunteer her time, sharing her experiences with others who were struggling. She wrote a small post about her journey with Shadow, hoping that her words could reach someone who needed to hear them. She didn't know if anyone would read it, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she was doing something. She was finally taking the steps toward a new chapter in her life. The next few weeks were filled with small victories. Ella continued to write, volunteering at the shelter, and slowly, her story began to spread. People reached out to her, thanking her for sharing her experiences, telling her how her words had touched their hearts. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about making a difference, no matter how small. And Ella realized that was enough. One afternoon, as Ella and Shadow walked down the familiar streets of Willow Creek, she couldn't help but notice how much had changed. The world around her seemed brighter, more alive. The weight that had once pressed down on her shoulders had lightened. She had learned that healing wasn't just about time, it was about action. It was about making choices that aligned with who she wanted to be. As they reached the edge of the park, Ella stopped and looked around. The trees were in full bloom, their leaves a vibrant green. The sun was warm against her skin, and the scent of fresh grass and flowers filled the air. It's funny, Ella said to Shadow, her voice soft but full of conviction. I used to be afraid of the future. I didn't know how I was supposed to move forward. But now, I realize that it's not about knowing the whole path, it's about taking one step at a time. Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes as steady as ever. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to do anything. He was simply there, just as he had always been. And for the first time in a long time, Ella felt the future was no longer a frightening unknown. It was a journey, and she was ready to take it. As the weeks passed, Ella's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The days no longer felt heavy with grief, nor did they feel like a constant search for answers. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had found her place in the world, even if it was still unfolding. Shadow had not only helped her heal, he had become her partner in this journey of change. The shelter where Ella volunteered became a second home. She didn't just work there, she connected with the animals, and in turn, she connected with the people who came through the doors. Ella spoke to those who had suffered loss, listened to their stories, and shared her own of a girl who had lost her way but had found her path again with the help of a dog named Shadow. And people listened. Her story, her words, began to reach others who felt lost, who felt unseen. It wasn't about saving the world. It was about offering something simple, a moment of connection, a story of healing, a belief that they, too, mattered. One afternoon, as Ella sat at the shelter, a woman in her early 50s walked through the door. She had a quiet demeanor, her eyes carrying a weight of their own, much like the one Ella had once carried. She looked around the shelter, her gaze landing on Ella. "I'm here to volunteer," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a sense of hesitation. I've read your story." Ella looked up, surprised. "My story?" The woman nodded, her eyes searching Ella's face. "I saw your post. The one about you and your dog. I lost my husband last year, and, well, I've been struggling to find my way. But when I read your story, something clicked. I want to help. I want to do what you're doing. Maybe it's time for me to heal too." Ella felt a lump form in her throat. The woman's words struck a chord deep inside her. It was the same way she had felt when she first started writing, unsure, hesitant, but also hopeful. "You're not alone," Ella said quietly, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "We're all just trying to figure it out, one step at a time." The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Ella smiled softly, her heart full. "We can start together," she said. Over the following months, Ella and the woman, whose name was Claire, formed a bond of their own. They worked side by side at the shelter, helping the animals, comforting each other, and sharing their journeys of loss and healing. It was clear that Ella had become not just a volunteer at the shelter, but a beacon of hope for others. She had taken the pain of her past and turned it into something meaningful, something that could help others find their way too. One evening, as Ella walked home with Shadow at her side, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The dog that had once been an outcast, wandering alone, had helped her rediscover herself. Now she had a purpose. She had found a way to turn her pain into something beautiful, something that helped others. "Can you believe it, Shadow?" Ella said softly, glancing down at the dog. "We've done it. We've turned everything around. I don't know where this path is taking me, but I know one thing. I'm not alone anymore." Shadow walked beside her, his tail swishing gently, his eyes bright and watchful. He had never asked for anything more than to be with her, and in return, he had given her everything. When they reached the house on Juniper Lane, Ella stopped for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob. Shadow stood beside her, as always, waiting. "You know," Ella said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think I finally figured it out. Sometimes, healing isn't about fixing everything or even understanding everything. Sometimes, it's just about knowing that you matter. Knowing that you have a place in this world, even if you don't know exactly where that place is." She smiled down at Shadow, who wagged his tail gently, as though agreeing with her. "Thanks, buddy," she whispered. "You've helped me more than you'll ever know." As Ella stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped her. For the first time, she didn't feel like something was missing. She didn't feel like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop or for the next wave of grief to come crashing over her. She felt whole. She felt at peace. As the months went by, the small changes that had taken place in Ella's life began to snowball into something far greater than she had ever imagined. The more she gave of herself, the more she received in return. The simple act of sharing her journey, of sharing her story with others, had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. The healing she had experienced with Shadow had turned into a beacon of hope for others who were struggling. Ella and Claire continued to work together at the shelter, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They shared their stories of loss and healing, finding comfort in knowing that they weren't alone in their pain. But more than that, they had found a shared purpose, a purpose that gave them both something to work toward. They weren't just healing themselves, they were helping others to heal too. It was one crisp morning in early fall when Ella realized just how far she had come. She and Claire had organized a small event at the shelter, a meet and greet for the animals in need of adoption. Ella had never imagined she'd be at the center of such an event, let alone be the one organizing it. But there she was, standing in front of a small crowd, her heart pounding as she welcomed the visitors. "Thank you all for coming today," Ella began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We're here to introduce you to some very special friends who are looking for a place to call home. But beyond that, we're here to share a message, one that's very close to my heart. The animals in this shelter, just like us, need love, patience, and understanding. They've all been through something, just like we have. And they deserve a second chance, just like we all do." Ella glanced down at Shadow, who was sitting quietly at her feet. He was her constant companion, the one who had taught her the power of stillness and presence. His calm demeanor was the perfect reflection of the message she wanted to share. "Shadow here," Ella continued, her voice thick with emotion, "has been with me through some of the hardest times in my life. And he's shown me that sometimes healing isn't about fixing everything. It's about giving love, patience, and a safe place to grow." The room was silent for a moment as the visitors listened intently to her words. Ella knew that many of them could relate to what she was saying. They had all come to the shelter for their own reasons, some to adopt a pet, others to offer their support, but they were all connected by a common thread: the need for connection, love, and healing. After the event, as Ella and Claire helped clean up, Claire turned to her with a smile. "I can't believe how much you've grown," she said. "You've come so far, Ella. I'm proud of you." Ella smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without Shadow." Claire chuckled. "You're the one who made the change, Ella. You're the one who decided to heal, to help others. Shadow's just been there to remind you of your strength." Ella nodded, her gaze drifting to the dog, who was now lying in a corner of the room, his eyes half closed but alert, as always. "I don't know where I'd be without him," Ella said softly. That evening, after the event had ended, Ella sat on the porch steps, Shadow curled up beside her. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo, the first stars beginning to appear. It was one of those peaceful nights where time seemed to slow down, where every moment felt full of possibility. Ella took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. "I think I finally understand," she said to Shadow. "All along, I thought I had to have everything figured out. I thought I had to be strong and have all the answers. But you showed me that it's okay to be still. It's okay to not have everything figured out. What matters is the love we give, the connections we make, and the peace we find within ourselves." Shadow lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers, as if to say, "I've always known." Ella smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've taught me everything I needed to know." The dog didn't respond, but Ella didn't need him to. His presence was enough. She had found peace in the stillness, and in the quiet connection they shared, she had found something she never thought she'd have again: hope. As the night wore on, Ella thought about the future. She still had a lot to learn, and there were challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. With Shadow by her side, she knew she could handle anything. The sound of Shadow's breathing beside her, steady and calm, was the most reassuring sound in the world. It was a reminder that no matter what, she was never truly alone. The days grew warmer as spring finally took hold of Willow Creek. The streets that had once been dusted with snow were now lined with blooming flowers, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of new life. Ella and Shadow continued their walks, their routine unchanged, but everything around them seemed to be changing. The world felt alive in a way that it hadn't for so long. Ella was no longer the girl who had walked into the shelter months ago, unsure of herself, struggling with grief and uncertainty. She had found her purpose, her voice, and a new sense of belonging. And it wasn't just because of Shadow, though he had been her steady companion and guide. It was because she had learned to listen to herself, to trust her own strength. One afternoon, as Ella sat in the living room writing in her journal, there was a soft knock at the door. She glanced up, slightly surprised, but stood to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Claire standing there, a small smile on her face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Claire said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Ella smiled and motioned for Claire to come inside. "Of course, you're not interrupting," she said. "I've been doing great. Just writing, reflecting. I feel like everything is finally coming together." Claire took a seat on the couch, and Ella sat across from her. "I'm really glad to hear that," Claire said softly. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day at the shelter about finding your purpose. You've really inspired me, Ella. I've started volunteering more, and I feel, I don't know, more alive, I guess. Like I'm doing something meaningful." Ella's heart swelled with pride. She had never imagined that her own healing journey would inspire others, but it was becoming clear that her story had touched more people than she had realized. And in turn, she realized that she was helping others heal, just as Shadow had helped her. "I'm so glad to hear that," Ella said, her voice full of warmth. "That's exactly what I want, just to share what I've learned, to help people see that they're not alone in their struggles. Healing isn't easy, but it's worth it." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I know," she said softly, "and it's because of you. You've given me hope, Ella, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Ella felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at her friend. She had never expected to be the one offering hope to someone else, but it was becoming clear that this was the very reason Shadow had come into her life, to teach her not just to heal, but to give that healing back to others. "I'm just glad we're all here together," Ella said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you, without Shadow." As if on cue, Shadow wandered into the room, his tail wagging slowly. He walked over to Claire and sat down beside her, his eyes calm and steady. "See," Ella said, a small smile crossing her face. "Even Shadow knows what we need. He's always here when we need him." Claire reached out and scratched behind Shadow's ears, her face softening as she looked at him. "I think he's got the right idea," Claire said with a laugh. "Maybe I need to learn how to be more like him, quiet, steady, always present." Ella laughed too, the sound a rare one, but one that felt like it had always belonged. "He's got a way of teaching us without saying a word, doesn't he?" For the rest of the afternoon, they talked about their lives, about the changes they had gone through, and about the future. There was no rush, no urgency, just two people sharing their experiences, finding comfort in each other's company. As the evening approached, Ella stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over everything. The world felt peaceful, full of possibility. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" Ella asked, turning back to Claire. Claire nodded slowly. "All the time. But I think that's the beauty of it. We don't have to know what's next, just that we're moving forward, one step at a time." Ella smiled, feeling that familiar sense of peace settle over her once more. "Yeah," she said softly, "one step at a time." The seasons continued their slow dance, shifting imperceptibly from the warmth of spring into the bright summer months. With each passing day, the bond between Ella and Shadow grew stronger. Together, they had weathered the storms of the past and emerged on the other side, stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Ella had always believed that healing came in waves, that it was a constant ebb and flow. But now, with Shadow by her side, she understood that healing wasn't about perfection or even completeness. It was about finding peace in the moments, in the quiet. It was about learning to embrace both the good and the bad, the silence and the noise, and finding beauty in the whole of it. One sunny afternoon, as Ella walked through the town square, she couldn't help but notice how different everything looked. The streets, once bare and cold, were now filled with life. Children played in the park, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The shops were bustling with activity, and the trees were fully dressed in their summer green. Ella's heart felt light as she walked, Shadow at her side. It was hard to believe that not so long ago, she had felt so lost in the world, so disconnected from everything around her. Now, the world seemed alive in a way that filled her with gratitude. She glanced down at Shadow, who was trotting alongside her, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes alert. He had become a part of her in a way that was hard to describe. He was not just a dog anymore. He was her companion, her teacher, her friend. His quiet presence had brought her peace, and his loyalty had helped her find strength in the most unexpected places. As they reached the town square, Ella paused for a moment to take it all in. The summer air was warm, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees, casting dappled shadows on the sidewalk. It felt like a moment of stillness in the midst of life's chaos, and Ella was grateful for it. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice soft but full of emotion, "I think we've found our place here." The dog looked up at her, his amber eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, Ella felt an overwhelming sense of love and connection. She had finally found her place, not just in Willow Creek, but within herself. As they continued to walk, Ella couldn't help but reflect on the journey she had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when she had wanted to give up, to let the grief and the pain consume her. But Shadow had been there, his silent presence offering her the strength she needed to keep moving forward. Ella had learned that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't something that could be completed or checked off a list. It was a process, an ongoing journey, one that ebbed and flowed, that twisted and turned, but ultimately led to a place of peace. When they reached the shelter, Ella felt a familiar sense of purpose stir within her. The place that had once been a source of fear and uncertainty for her had become a sanctuary of sorts. It wasn't just a building filled with animals, it was a place of healing for both the animals and the people who came through its doors. As she walked inside, Darlene greeted her with a smile. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "We've got a few new faces today. They could use someone like you to show them the ropes." Ella smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'll be right there," she said, walking toward the back of the shelter where the new arrivals were waiting. As she approached the kennels, she saw a small, scruffy dog sitting quietly in one of the cages. His fur was matted and his eyes were wide with uncertainty. Ella knelt down in front of him, her heart softening at the sight of his timid gaze. "Hey there," she said gently, her voice soothing. "It's okay. You're safe now." The dog didn't move, but Ella could feel the hesitation in his eyes. He was scared, but he wasn't giving up. He was waiting for someone to believe that he mattered, just like Shadow had once waited for her. Ella smiled softly, her heart full of understanding. "I know how you feel," she whispered, "but you don't have to be alone anymore." She reached out and slowly opened the kennel door. The dog looked up at her, his body tense, but his eyes softening with trust. For a moment, neither of them moved, and then, slowly, the dog took a hesitant step toward her. Ella's eyes filled with tears as she scooped the dog into her arms, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in her chest. This was what it was all about, the quiet healing that came from being there for someone, from offering them a safe space, a place to heal. And in that moment, Ella realized that the cycle of healing had come full circle. She had once been the one who was lost, who had needed someone to believe she mattered. And now, she was the one offering that belief to others, just as Shadow had offered it to her. The days had grown longer as the summer deepened, but for Ella, each new day brought more clarity. She had finally stepped into a place of peace within herself, and now, with Shadow by her side, she was ready to share that peace with the world. The lessons she had learned about patience, silence, and healing had become the foundation of her new purpose. The shelter, once a place where she had come seeking solace, was now her home in more ways than one. Ella had started organizing events, not just for the animals, but for the people who came to the shelter, those looking for healing, looking for peace. She had found a way to combine her passion for helping animals with her own healing journey. It wasn't just about the dogs anymore. It was about people too. One warm afternoon, as Ella sat at a desk in the shelter, drafting a letter for an upcoming fundraising event, she received a message from the local library. They were holding a community reading night for people to share stories of personal growth and healing, and they wanted Ella to be one of the featured speakers. The invitation felt like a turning point for her. In that moment, Ella realized how far she had come. Not too long ago, she couldn't imagine sharing her story with anyone. But now she had found the courage to do just that. To stand in front of people, to share her journey, and to help them understand that healing was possible. A few days later, Ella stood in front of a small crowd at the local library, the familiar hum of conversation dying down as she walked to the podium. Shadow was sitting quietly at her feet, his steady presence grounding her. She had never spoken in front of a crowd before, but this time, she felt different. This time, she had something to say. "Good evening," Ella began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I'm not an expert or a professional, but I'm here because I know that healing isn't something that happens overnight. It's a journey, one that takes time, patience, and the willingness to listen to yourself." She glanced down at Shadow, who was sitting calmly by her side. "I didn't always know that. A year ago, I was lost. I had lost someone very important to me, and I didn't know how to find my way again. But then I met Shadow, and through him, I learned something that changed my life. I learned that sometimes you don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes you just need to be still. You need to be present, and you need to allow yourself to heal at your own pace." The room was silent, and Ella could feel the weight of the words as they left her mouth. She had never spoken so openly before, but it felt natural now. It felt right. "I'm not here to tell you that everything will be okay instantly," Ella continued, "but I am here to tell you that it will get better. And it starts with believing that you matter. That no matter what you've been through, you have the strength to move forward. And sometimes that strength comes from the simplest of things: a dog's quiet presence, a moment of stillness, a person who listens without judgment. The room was still, but there was a warmth that filled the air, an unspoken connection between Ella and the people who were listening to her. She had no grand solution to offer them, no magic cure, but she had something real, something tangible. She had her story. Ella finished her speech, and there was a moment of silence before the crowd began to applaud. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. And for Ella, that was enough. After the event, people came up to her, thanking her for sharing her story. Some of them had tears in their eyes, others simply nodded in understanding. It wasn't just about the dogs. It wasn't just about Shadow. It was about the shared experience of healing, of growing, and of finding strength in the quiet moments. As Ella and Shadow left the library, walking out into the cool night air, Ella felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had given a piece of herself to others, and in doing so, she had received something back. She had found her voice. "Well, buddy," Ella said, looking down at Shadow, who was trotting happily beside her. "I think we started something here." Shadow looked up at her, his eyes calm and steady as ever, and Ella knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed were marked by a new energy for Ella. The library event had sparked something inside her, a sense of purpose that she hadn't fully realized before. As she shared her story with others, Ella began to understand that healing wasn't just about personal recovery. It was about creating a space for others to find their own healing too. The shelter, which had once been a place where Ella had simply volunteered, became the hub for her growing efforts to help people. She started to organize small community outreach programs where she shared her experiences with others, just as she had done at the library. But now, her outreach wasn't limited to simply offering her story. It was about creating a space where people could come together and find strength in their shared experiences. Every weekend, Ella would stand in front of small groups, talking about her healing journey, the role that Shadow had played in it, and how finding quiet moments of connection could change everything. Some people came to her for advice, others for support. But it wasn't just about talking, it was about listening. Ella had learned that sometimes the most important thing wasn't speaking, but being present for someone else, offering them the same quiet space that Shadow had given her. One afternoon, as Ella was setting up for another outreach program, she noticed an older woman sitting quietly in the corner of the shelter, watching the other attendees. Her face was lined with age and experience, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Ella walked over to her, a soft smile crossing her face. "Hi, I'm Ella," she said gently. "Is this your first time here?" The woman looked up at her, her expression guarded, but not unfriendly. "Yes," she replied quietly. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but I thought maybe I could learn something here." Ella nodded, her heart going out to the woman. She had seen so many people come through the shelter, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories of loss and longing. But she also knew that the first step was always the hardest. "You're in the right place," Ella said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes, just being here is the first step toward healing." The woman seemed to relax slightly at her words, a small sigh escaping her lips. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to move on from it. I've been lost. And I thought maybe this place could help." Ella nodded, understanding more than she could say. "I get it," she said softly. "I was in that place too. But what I've learned is that you don't have to figure everything out at once. Healing happens little by little, sometimes without us even realizing it. The important thing is to take that first step, just like you did by coming here." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of release. She smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Ella smiled back, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. "You're not alone," she said, "and you don't have to do this by yourself." As the program continued, Ella noticed the woman slowly start to open up to others, sharing her story with a small group of people. Ella felt a sense of pride in her heart, not just for herself, but for the woman and for everyone who had come to the shelter seeking something, whether it was healing, companionship, or simply a space to be understood. That night, as Ella and Shadow walked home, the sun setting low behind them, Ella felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey she had started months ago had come full circle. She had started this path looking for answers, but now she knew that the answers weren't something you could find. They were something you could create, step by step, moment by moment. "I think we're doing something good, buddy," Ella said, her voice full of quiet determination. "Something important." Shadow walked beside her, his pace slow but steady, his presence as grounding as ever. Ella had learned that change didn't always have to come with grand gestures or dramatic shifts. Sometimes it came in the form of small moments of quiet conversations and shared understanding. And it was these moments that had the power to change everything. When they reached home, Ella stood for a moment at the doorway, looking out at the peaceful street. The world felt still, but not empty. It was full of possibility, full of quiet hope. And in that moment, Ella knew that she had found her place in it. Not just as someone who had healed, but as someone who could help others heal too. The seasons had come full circle in Willow Creek. The first snow had fallen, dusting the town in a blanket of white once again. But for Ella, this was no longer a time of sorrow or uncertainty. It was a time of reflection, of looking back on the path she had walked and realizing just how far she had come. She stood at the edge of the park, the place where it all began. The swings, now swaying gently in the winter wind, reminded her of the stillness she had once feared. She smiled softly, her heart full as she looked down at Shadow, who was sitting quietly beside her, his amber eyes reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. "You know, buddy," Ella said, her voice calm and sure, "I think we've found our place in this world. Together, we've made something beautiful." Shadow looked up at her, his tail giving a small thump, as if to say, "I've always known." Ella laughed softly and crouched down to scratch behind his ears. "Thank you for being with me every step of the way. I couldn't have done this without you." And as she stood, looking out at the quiet, peaceful world around her, Ella knew that this was just the beginning. She had found her voice, and now she had found her place in the world. She was no longer the girl who had walked into Willow Creek lost and broken. She was someone new, someone who had found strength in silence, love in stillness, and hope in the most unexpected places. Together with Shadow, Ella was ready to continue her journey, step by step, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.